This is the Meaningful Content Mixer. We are your co-hosts. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Bonnie. This podcast is for content creators seeking inspiration across disciplines to create more meaningful content.
From pre-sales to post-sales, we want to learn from each other because we are experienced enough to know how much we don't know yet.
Let's get started. Hey, Sarah.
Hey, Bonnie.
Welcome back.
Yeah, good to see you as usual.
You too. So today we're talking about the last episode that we had, which was with Melida Belcher.
Yeah, we talked to Melinda about voice of the customer, and in some ways it was about alignment, but I really see it more as she talked about how to really incorporate the voice of the customer throughout customer interactions across departments, cross-functionally, from the research phase all the way through working with their user interfaces, their partners, their clients, and things like that. How do you consistently get that voice of the customer incorporated appropriately?
Yeah, exactly. And from voice of the customer, what we're really talking about is understanding the words that they use and kind of incorporating that back into your own content in order to better reach them, wherever they may be. From a pre-sales to post-sales perspective, I think it's important all the way around.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes when we say voice of the customer, we don't take it as literally as we should. Sometimes it's meant more to inform value propositions or to talk about what they care about. But in many cases, being quite literal with your word choice, as you said, can be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I really liked about that conversation was just the fact that it reminded me to go back and really think about the customer. And I know that is it's almost like a silly thing to say, that I need to understand how our customers are speaking and what words they use and things like that. But in reality, this is something that has to be done regularly, understanding the words that the customers use, how they're using your product, the way that they describe their problems and things like that. Those are all really key. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how to do this from a just from any perspective. How can we capture the voice of the customer? And whether you're pre-sales or post-sales, having those conversations with the customer is probably the best way to get the voice of the customer. But sometimes that's not possible. And so, what are some ways that that people can get voice of the customer if they're not talking directly to them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I was thinking about this a bunch too, almost the sense of like, how does each person in an organization, especially content creators, but really everyone should do this, is how are they getting their almost weekly dose of the voice of their customer? I think I'm guilty, even as obsessed as I feel that I am with customer perspective, and my job is creating content for customers, for self-service experiences, or directly for support to interact with customers. I probably don't actually directly consume our customers' words as often as I should. And I think in every organization, it's going to look different, but it's almost, I would recommend doing an inventory of cross-functionally, what are all the ways that your organization captures the voice of the customer. So a really simple one is search logs. I talk about search logs often as a wonderful source of trying to understand what your users are saying, both their word choice, how they think about things, if they're phrasing things from a problem perspective or whatever it may be. If your website has a search bar, there are search logs somewhere. Go see what those, get access to those, and look at them. And then of course, Melinda talked about user testing, where, how does that occur? Are those calls recorded? Speaking of recorded calls, think about prospect calls from your sales team, upsell conversations with your CSMs or account managers, certainly any sort of support interactions, all these things exist and are captured and recorded. And start by making an inventory of what those sources are, and then give yourself a little weekly assignment of, picking from the menu. What are you going to look at?
Yeah, I like that. And one of my roles previously as a tech writer, we weren't really allowed to speak directly to the customer. We couldn't email them. We couldn't ask them questions directly. We had to go through a different department, whether it was user experience or product or support or one of those other departments. And so I think, it can be easy to say, well, I don't have access to the customer, so I can't, you know, get the voice of the customer, but that's kind of an excuse because the information exists. You just kind of have to go find it.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. So that's something, even I think for myself, I'm going to make my little menu of all the ways that we capture the voice of the customer and make sure that every week I'm consuming something from them directly.
Yeah. Weekly dose. I love that. And something I think is also important to consider is, the customer can be many audiences. Mm-hmm. So just because, they're a customer doesn't necessarily mean it's the right voice, but which customer are you talking to? And the reason I say that is because having moved from a post-sales role to a pre-sales role and kind of looking at those different audiences, one of the things that I right now as a product marketer have to consider is the buyer. So my audience is the buyer, and whoever that buyer is really the voice that I'm looking to leverage in my content. And if on the other hand, when I was a tech writer, my audience was the user, the end user who's actually going in and using the product. And so depending on who your audience is within that customer base, I think is still key. It's something to remember. Because if you're talking to the CEO of a company, he may not understand how to use the product versus if you're trying to talk about ROI and how much to invest versus save, that may not necessarily impact the end user directly. So just some things to consider when you're going out to look for that voice is not just the customer, but the target segment within that customer base.
Yeah, and depending on what you're working on, how that's going to turn into an interaction, who that is going to be an interaction with, that your voice might change, your word choice might change a little bit. Now, something that shouldn't change that Melinda made me think about is the idea of that from a marketing perspective. This is more about effort than voice. Mm-hmm. Like, I think from a marketing perspective, the folks, it's really important to try to make it easy for prospects, for buyers to understand who you are and how you can help them. And I have a hunch that as we move along the customer journey in an organization, we maybe lose sight of that a little bit, mm-hmm. or we sort of knock that down in terms of priority when it comes to making things low effort for the end users, that no matter who they are or where they are in their customer lifecycle with you, it's really important to make things as easy as possible for them. So that's making things concise and clear, that fifth grade mm-hmm. reading level.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Making things accessible wherever they are, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I like that the reference to the fifth grade reading level, because it can be so easy to fill your content with jargon, with technical information, especially when you're dealing with technical content, or if you're in marketing, you're trying to make it sound super smart, super special. Yeah. It can be easy to default to that jargon and that the overloading with technical words and phrases and things like that. So I think that fifth grade reading level is really key, and makes it almost more challenging to differentiate, mm-hmm. because you're having to really think about how you're wording your content for, that level.
Yeah, because I think we sometimes make assumptions that because someone's a customer, maybe they've gone through an onboarding process that was a little bit more, mm-hmm. that involved more hand holding, but now they're a customer and they're established and they know us, they get our jargon, they get our features, but we have to remember that we're usually just one little piece in their huge puzzle. So, yep. So just because they're a longtime customer, they're not familiar with our jargon. Maybe they forgot something that they learned during onboarding. And so every interaction needs to be low effort and catered to what makes things easiest for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, another way to capture that Melinda mentioned was user testing.
Yep. Yeah, agreed. The user testing. And I love how she gave the example of how they have other folks in the organization observe user testing. This goes back to making that inventory of the voice of your customer in your organization. Find out if that's happening, if that's something you can observe. The more folks you can get involved to hear that directly, the better.
Yeah. What I love about user testing is the realness that comes from it. So, there are many ways to capture a voice of the customer, whether it's getting feedback, doing a survey, doing an interview. But when it comes to user testing, you kind of get firsthand feedback. You get the real emotion behind it, the frustrations that they may be having as they're using the product. And you get the true voice. So that's always a fun one. I really enjoy that one.
Yeah, I think it's another way also to, again, break down those assumptions that I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
One example I can give is years ago, for many years, I worked at a cybersecurity software company, and we had both a consumer product and an enterprise product. And I was part of a tech rating team. And I know for a long time, we kind of assumed that our consumers, our sort of home users, had a lower level of technical know-how than our enterprise customers or our business customers. And we kind of let ourselves get away with making our business customers sort of rise to our level rather than the other way around. And after years of better understanding our customers, I think even on the enterprise side, we came to learn that a lot of times those folks, they weren't IT experts, right? They weren't enterprise software experts. They were just trying to get their job done, handle cybersecurity, and move on with their day. And we had, through things like user testing, we learned to sort of talk to them in a different way.
Yeah.
Finally, something from Melinda's conversation that was one of my favorite takeaways so far, and this is my biggest personal action item from that conversation, is when she talked about the idea of evolving a style guide, a writing style guide, into more of a pattern library.
Yes.
And so I'm really motivated to figure out how to reframe our internal style guide into something more usable and that's organized more like a pattern library so that we can incorporate it more into our day-to-day.
Yeah, I like that idea. And actually, one of the things that I was thinking about as she was talking about it is how can I incorporate this, create some sort of messaging library or something similar, but with messaging. From a marketing perspective, a lot of what gets created on my end is content that needs to be adapted. So I can build out general messaging for different audiences. And then as people have presentations, conversations, emails, things like that, they can take that content that I write and adapt it to the specific message that they're trying to tell. And so I feel like having some sort of pattern library of messaging would be a fun challenge to try to take on.
Yeah, I like that idea. When I think about writing style guides and how they're typically organized, and I have some of my favorites out there I can link to in the show notes. They're organized by things like grammar and punctuation and visuals and labels. They're organized in a way where all those things sort of they're there, but they're not connected. And the idea of pattern library, I'm thinking about, and this is still in progress, so bear with me. It's still in progress in my mind, but how could you reorganize the components of a writing style guide into something that's more oriented around how a page actually comes together? Again, taking inspiration from a UI pattern library, the types of interactions that are happening on a page, and then what are the elements that you need to bring into that in combination, not in isolation, in different references. Yeah, so I did find an example. It's not quite there, but it's something that I think is kind of a starting point to visualize what I'm talking about here. So I found what's called the Carbon Design System. This is IBM's open source design system for products and digital experiences. It's at carbondesignsystem.com. And a lot of the elements of this design system are typical of a pattern library, but within it, they have what's called a pattern section. And they have things like dialogues and forms and login screens and notifications. And in this example, once again, they're not including actual verbiage snippets, actual content snippets, which you can actually take this to the next step when it comes to operationalizing a style guide. So I can imagine creating something like this. Again, it's from a more functional perspective or an interaction perspective rather than a dictionary perspective. And that's what I want to try to create for my work. Well, I'm excited to try this out for myself and hear an update from you about how it goes as well. And
it should be fun.
Yeah, and as always, we'd love to hear examples from any listeners about how they're incorporating voice of the customer or operationalizing, style guide and consistent messaging.
Well, I look forward to seeing what you come up with.
Me too. Talk soon.
All right, talk soon.